So what is intersectional feminism and why is it important? Well, we've been talking about women and power against the backdrop of women's political participation. And there's so much excitement now that we have to really think about, what do we know about women and political participation historically? What are some of the lessons that we might learn from it? Well, let's think a minute about the struggle for women's political power right here in the United States. In about 15, 20 years, we're going to celebrate the centennial of women's right to vote. And knowing as I do how we in America like to celebrate things like anything that happened here was the greatest thing to ever happen in the world, I can imagine how excited everybody's gonna be. But here's the question. When do I, as an African American woman, get to celebrate my entry into the political community? In reality, I've got to wait another 40 years to celebrate because the situation was that giving blacks to vote did not empower blacks who were women. And giving women the right to vote did not empower women who were black. So this, quite simply, is what I call structural intersectionality, the collision of two overlapping dynamics of oppression. Patriarchy reared its head during the debate over the 15th Amendment. It was the Negro's hour, they said, right? So the Negro's hour apparently meant that it was not Negro women's hour, it was Negro men's hour. Well, what happened when the women's hour came to vote some 30 years later? By that time, blacks had been so thoroughly disenfranchised that black women won nothing when women won the right to vote. Now, you're not going to read this story in our history books, and it certainly isn't part of our political culture. We celebrate women's enfranchisement and the women who led the struggle as though it's an unabashed victory for women. The fact that a whole lot of women were left at the station falls from our consciousness, as does the racial strategy that the suffragettes followed to win the vote for women. In fact, one of the main arguments for women's suffrage was that it would help shore up white supremacy. Women, it was argued, would be the helpmates to maintain the American way of life against lower order citizens and all these immigrants. Adding millions of white women voters to the rolls would ensure that democracy would survive. It was not an accidental argument, nor an isolated one. Now, I don't want this to be a one-sided critique, because African American men weren't any better on the question of whether black women should get the right to vote. His basic sense was that they were better off left disenfranchised. With friends like these, need I say more? So what's the moral of this story? Why is this important? I mean, you might say, come on, this is ancient history. What does it have to do with contemporary politics? Well, let's ask a couple questions. What might have happened had enfranchisement truly been universal? If women's power wasn't seen and celebrated as white women's power, if enfranchising the slaves had not been seen as enfranchising the men, if feminism had been seen early on as incorporating all women, black and immigrant, Native and Asian, if anti-racism had been seen as incorporating all people of color, men as well as women, what might have happened and where would our culture be now if the fight against patriarchy and the fight against white supremacy had not become alien to each other? And if the women who were subject to both had been centered rather than marginalized in these struggles? We can barely imagine how political life might be different in the here and now.
Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. Before we begin, a quick thank you and a plug. We continue to be blown away by the support of our patrons, who not only support us financially, but have helped us create a community. Unlike some other podcasts, we have an entire project here, and our Patreon keeps it functioning. The highlight of this community, to me, is the Discord, in which we all share ideas and information and hash out disagreements and interpretations. Perhaps more importantly for this podcast, we get to hear critiques and suggestions on what we put out, which is immensely helpful. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably follow us on social media and are probably very online. If you are, in fact, very online, you're probably looking for some form of community. If this describes you, dear listener, then consider becoming a patron today at patreon.com/Millennial-Review, where you get to interact with us and a growing network of people committed to a better world. If you are unable to provide financial support, consider sharing the show with a friend and giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. This episode is the second part of a podcast on feminism for the 99%. If you haven't listened to part 1, I would recommend you do so. It's replete with critical context for how to understand feminism from a leftist perspective, as well as my ramblings. On that point, I am open to and welcoming of feedback on how I approach these solo podcasts. The main dilemma that a podcast host on a show like this faces is attempting to navigate the balance of formal with informal. I would love to just press record and start talking, but I have a responsibility to give you accurate information because that's what this podcast is designed to do. I'm personally not a fan of this idea of objective politics. People will often ask me, especially after they hear I'm a political science person, what is a news source that's trustworthy and objective? To me, that's two very different questions. The podcast you're listening to is far from objective, but is it trustworthy? Yes, and in fact, we're much more trustworthy because we tell you we're not objective. I would challenge anyone to find any of the factual claims made on this podcast to be incorrect. I'm very meticulous and paranoid about my data and facts coming from reputable sources. But when people ask for objectivity, I not only find it to be impossible, but actually undesirable. One objective truth is kind of authoritarian, no? Politics is and should be a contestation of ideas and power. And unintentionally, what I just did was a perfect example of exactly the issue I'm talking about. I like to be as informal and conversational as possible on these podcasts without sacrificing accuracy. As such, I have to write the episode, but I do so in a way that is as lax as possible. Aside from the reading and the research, I write these episodes as a pure stream of conscience. I write very quickly after I develop my framework and gather my sources. And because I think about how I think a lot, a portion of what I'll do is just me telling you why I'm talking about the things at all and how I came to conclusions, which sometimes takes 60 seconds and sometimes takes 10 minutes. If you see the topic and you're excited to hear just the information about that topic, I can see frustration with my taking a 15-minute circuitous journey to get there. One of the reasons I've continued to approach my episodes in this way is because I got early feedback that people liked my abnormal style, but I want to make sure that these weren't just early adopters, and that as we branch out, people don't want more streamlined information. Because if so, I will sell out immediately. So we left off in part 1, having defined the issue we're talking about pretty extensively, which is worthwhile and important because I think both sides very much miss the boat. I've obviously already talked about non- or anti-feminists, but I also see online discussion, which is all about the patriarchy, and limiting oneself to that framework just means you miss a ton. When I see people online say, all men are trash, I'm not offended by it. I understand it, and as a meme it can be and often is really funny. But I've also been down identitarian Twitter rabbit holes and found discourse in which all men being irredeemable, violent misogynists is a perfectly genuine sentiment by which people live their lives. Aside from the fact that this is a deeply flawed argument that 1, empirically isn't true, and 2, to the extent that it is true, ignores systemic factors, it's extremely fatalistic to the point of advocating for almost a gendered version of an ethno-state. So I'm black, but am very much against black nationalism because I'm against nationalism of any kind. I've also learned a lot from black nationalism and even admired some black nationalists. And it's obviously not in the same ballpark as white nationalism because you're talking about a marginalized group trying to become less marginalized rather than a powerful group trying to gain even more power. So I feel the exact same about anti-men feminists. I think men's rights advocates, just like white nationalists, are absolute dangerous monsters who are an active threat to society. I don't believe the same for feminists who believe that no man is ever to be trusted and they are all sexually abusive physical aggressors. Some feminist theorists who believe this write some very good theory that I think is worthwhile. But, like black nationalists, I still oppose them because I think their end goal is counterproductive. If all men are trash by birth, then society can't be fixed, and we might as well just pack it in and accept the hell we live in. Instead, I say we take feminism and combine it with socialism such that we change the underlying structures that empower women while simultaneously ending the social reproduction that makes men believe they have a justification to enact both physical violence and emotional subjugation upon a group they have been tacitly raised to believe is inferior to their own. I do want to add a quick note here before we move into solutions as a sort of addendum but also transition, because this is key. A patron pointed out that in addition to the standard thinking about a gender wage gap, there's also a gap between women with children and women without that is equally critical to take into account. In the literature, this is called the motherhood penalty. The data is pretty stunning. After a woman has her first child, on average, her earnings drop by 30% for the first 2 years, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. After 2 years, that dip in her original baseline earnings rises back up to a loss of 22%. The research conducted a 20-year study, and after a full 20 years, the woman, again obviously on average, never rises above the 22% decrease in her original baseline salary. So she never gets it back, ever. For the simplest possible illustration, let's say she was making $100,000 before the baby. For the first 2 years, her earnings drop down to $70,000, and for the rest of her working career, she never gets back above $78,000. Men who have their first child, conversely, see no dip until about year 9, and then they see a small decrease down to about 3% after 20 years. This data is stunning and also extremely important for 2 reasons. 1. Once again, anti-wage gap people will tell you the wage gap is fake for this very reason. It's not discrimination, it's just that women choose to have kids. If they didn't, along with their other bullshit talking points I already addressed about application and salary negotiations and dangerous work, then women would make the same wages as men. These arguments are just jaw-droppingly stupid. If women just didn't do the primary thing they are biologically designed to do, and which the economic system that you advocate for demands, then they could make the same money as men. The second reason why these arguments are important but also frustrating is a very simple question. What the hell does capitalism want? This is why Marx and so many after him have focused so intently on capitalism's contradictions. Women have to have babies in order to create a robust and constantly replenishing labor force. Capitalists want society to look more or less like a pyramid, where we have very few old and infirm people and an influx of labor desperate for work. A large and desperate labor supply means competition for wages, and then McDonald's pays you $7.25 because if you won't do it for that wage, 40 other people will. Okay, well then logically, an alien from outer space would say, surely this economic system takes care of mothers so they can produce and raise good workers, right? Nope, the exact fucking opposite. It gives a 20+% penalty to these women. It guts their finances and economic security such that having a baby is perhaps the worst investment a woman can make, despite it being necessary for the capitalist economy to keep functioning. Why do they do this? I'm glad you asked, Mr. Alien. Because that baby isn't going to be able to create value for the economy for at least 18 years, and capitalism can't think in that long of terms. In fact, it's more worried about that woman getting back to work right this second than raising that child, even if she's 50 years old and only has a limited amount of working years left. Hell, even if she was 65 and going to retire in 2 years, capitalism is still more worried about those 2 years of labor than the lifetime that well-adjusted and healthy child will provide, because capitalism thinks only in terms of quarterly earnings. So how do we solve all of this? Well, first it's worth quickly surveying what has been tried thus far. The way we don't solve this, to be certain, is a form of glass-ceiling liberal feminism, which has thus far been the solution unsurprisingly pushed by our ruling class. Every once in a while, I hear Republican arguments that are right for all the wrong reasons that fascinate me. I've talked about quite a few over the history of this podcast. At the beginning of the first episode, you heard me talk about their climate change argument. Another argument that we heard during the primary in 2016, and probably only the real politics heads will recall this, was when Carly Fiorina was making a pretty strong showing in the polls. She had a bump early on before Trump's big rise, and she was in second place for a week or two. As the media started shining a critical light on her, as they do when candidates become more prominent, obviously, Republicans cried foul. They said, you all celebrate the idea of having a woman president in Hillary Clinton, but not Carly Fiorina because she's a Republican. They're right. That is a fantastic point. Again, not for the reasons they think, but a fantastic point nonetheless. I want a woman to be president. I think a woman would bring unique experiences to the job that men don't, and we have an extremely strong body of political science research showing that women are more progressive than men and better decision makers under pressure. So that would obviously be a good thing. But I don't want Carly Fiorina. Why? Because Carly Fiorina does absolutely nothing for women's issues. Quite the opposite. She's anti-choice and wants to cut medical care, among a myriad of other anti-women policies I could spend 10 minutes listing. Here's my distinction with identity politics, and I'm going to say it over and over again. Bad identity politics are when you say, I'm a woman, so vote for me, it would be historic. Bad identity politics is when the official Democratic account on Twitter says you can't critique a Native American congresswoman after she voted to fund child concentration camps. That's a bad and cynical use of identity. Good identity politics are when you utilize the unique experiences you have as a member of a marginalized group in order to advance the cause of liberation for that group. Conservatives will try to contort the definition so that it excludes him, but there's literally no way you can say that Martin Luther King wasn't using identity politics. Of course he was. And he was using it in the best way possible. Same with the Stonewall riots and Latino activists and feminists. This is what we need to be focused on. We need to promote a diverse array of voices of individuals pushing for the emancipation of all people. It is necessary, but also not sufficient, that members of all groups are included as frontline leaders in our politics. This is what it means for groups to have actual, real representation, and for those outside the group to be allies. Glass ceiling politics is disastrous. What did electing Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May do for working women in Britain? What would electing Hillary Clinton have done for working women in the United States? The answer is literally nothing. As Bhattacharya, Aruza, and Fraser in their manifesto call it, breaking the glass ceiling and leaving the majority to clean up the shards. And the glass ceiling idea isn't just electing politicians, by the way. They also want more girl bosses. Let's say we could snap our fingers and make 50% of CEOs women tomorrow. Would we do it? I mean, I guess. Would it change anything for any of us? Not in any tangible way. Representation matters, but only if what's being represented is positive. I don't want my future daughter to see herself in a CEO. I want her to see herself in activists and community leaders and public intellectuals and regular-ass women who find their passion and happiness through whatever they find enjoyable. And think about the relations we discussed earlier. One of the big proposals for empowering women is these small business loans. Elizabeth Warren just proposed the same thing for black business owners. All this is doing is replacing one dominant class relation for another. And this can sound just like me being a hard-headed leftist that is anti-reform, but it's genuinely not. Who would these so-called microloans help? Well, they would help upper middle class women climb a little bit higher by expanding their business or maybe starting a second one. Would they help poor women? Well, the empirical evidence suggests they have a tiny effect as a couple of those loans turn into successful businesses, but it seems pretty clear with this very marginal benefit that the bad outweighs the good. One, it ties these women's livelihood to financiers, further increasing the political power of the financial industry rather than the women. Two, it creates massive debt cycles that we've seen ravage marginalized communities for centuries now. This is not the answer. Another push from liberal feminists, and trust me as the researcher for this episode when I say you'd be absolutely amazed how many liberals think this is a very serious solution, is to be more aggressive in applying the legal system. So, at a very surface level, this makes some sense, right? We all know that police don't do shit during domestic violence calls, and the reason we have such low rates of police reporting is because women know they aren't going to actually do anything about it. We give much more leeway on rape cases than most developed legal systems in the world. So if domestic violence plays a significant role in holding women back in society, and it's unmistakably true by the numbers that this is the case, what if we just locked up more men? I want to read from the aforementioned manifesto on this point, because they sum the issue up well. Quote, "The conventional feminist response to gender violence are understandable, but nonetheless inadequate. The most widespread response is the demand for criminalization and punishment. This carceral feminism, as it has been called, takes for granted precisely what needs to be called into question: the mistaken assumption that the laws, police, and courts maintain sufficient autonomy from the capitalist power structure to counter its deep-seated tendency to generate gender violence. In fact, the criminal justice system disproportionately targets poor and working-class men of color, including migrants, while leaving their white-collar professional counterparts free to rape and batter. It also leaves women to pick up the pieces, traveling long distances to visit incarcerated sons and husbands, providing for their households alone, and dealing with legal and bureaucratic fallout of imprisonment. At the same time, the carceral response overlooks the importance of exit options for survivors. Laws criminalizing marital rape or workplace assault won't help women with nowhere to go, nor those with no way to get there. Under such conditions, no feminists with even a shred of sensitivity to class and race can endorse a response to gender violence." End quote. So put simply, locking people up isn't going to achieve the results we desire. We already have a quarter of the world's prison population. It doesn't work. It doesn't stop them from reoffending later, and in fact makes it more likely that they do so. It leaves women in an extremely vulnerable place. And most importantly, it literally does nothing to solve the problem for anyone but the liberal bourgeois who already have the resources necessary to escape their situation and flee to a better life. The key here is power dynamics, and this is true of our entire movement. The other day, Ilhan Omar, who is the singular politician I advocate for without reservation, responded to Nancy Pelosi shitting on progressives and said the following, quote, "We're not in the business of asking to share that power. We're in the business of trying to grab that power so we can push for what we were put in the majority for, which is to resist and insist on policies that will push this country forward." Now, obviously, I'm to the left of Omar, and I'm not an elected official, so we're talking about slightly different behavior, but that is exactly right. The only people that talk about this clearly are Omar and Bernie Sanders. If all I cared about was having good policies, I would be one of the people saying it's Sanders or Warren. Now, he's a bit better than her on policy, but it's really not that substantial, and she has some policies that are better than his, frankly. So why, instead, do I say we absolutely have to get Bernie Sanders elected president, and then, if he drops out, Elizabeth Warren is the one person I'll vote for without being completely depressed in doing so? Because Bernie understands power and Elizabeth Warren does not. It's that simple. And none of the Democrats do, by the way. Barack Obama chief among them. He wasn't a failure as president because he was lying when he said he wanted change. He was a failure as president because he didn't understand how change happened. Best evidenced by the fact he disbanded his massive grassroots organization the minute he got elected. Women will be liberated when they have power in society. It's that straightforward. Women have very little of that in the current moment. When men need to leave relationships, they leave. When women need to do so, they often can't unless they wish to subject themselves to homelessness or massive instability. That is power. A shit ton of it. Free market economists are obsessed with this idea of mobility. Could I move to LA tomorrow and pursue a career even if it took me a month to get the job? That's a huge question for the health of an economy. These economists are paranoid and sounding the alarm at the fact that mobility has been dropping, but almost always ignore the gender component of it. If a woman had anything even approximating mobility, power relations would change overnight. What control do I have over you as a man if you can just up and leave when you get sick of my bullshit? Marxists don't put it in those terms, but I do. Really try to take yourself outside of our socially replicated gendered understanding of the world and think about this. There's a whole genre of jokes around dads leaving their wife and kids and men cheating and men paying child support. But what's the underlying premise in these jokes? They have the ability to do all these things. That's power. So how do we start empowering women in the true sense? Not to be multimillionaire Emily's List neoliberal congresswomen or run for president or be CEO of ExxonMobil, but true emancipation for the female working class. There's a lot to say about this, but I think it really begins and ends with redefining how we value and compensate labor. I should also preface this by saying something that will be intuitive to everyone listening, but which we can't undersell. For all this to work, women need to have full reproductive rights. You'd be surprised at how many women lack access to birth control in the year 2019. Every single woman should have easy access to free birth control, period. And it's just the unfortunate reality that we don't currently have adequate male birth control beyond condoms, and nobody trusts men on that front, so women need to be able to prevent unwanted pregnancy. That's a really big deal that we all know, but don't push for hard enough. We should be obsessively lobbying local, state, and federal politicians for this extremely cheap measure that would go a long way to helping working class women. But here's the thing. Women are never going to stop having children, and although we very much need to re-engineer social reproductive messaging, women are always going to spend more time with a baby than men do. This is more biological than anything else, and true of the majority of species across the animal kingdom. There's some pretty good science that says men struggle to feel connection to the baby for the first 2-ish years before mental connection measures are equaled out between mom and dad. You could say there are social factors involved, but that's a tough sell in my view. Anyways, even if it weren't the case that women spent more time with the baby after it was born, you still spend 9 months with it inside of you. We have to make visible the role of gendered unpaid work, including not just child rearing, but housework, which again should be done equally by men, but which we can compensate in the meantime, right? We could compensate it tomorrow, whereas changing the social structure for men to be household workers could easily take 50 years, and I don't think any of us are interested in waiting, though of course we should get started. So on the policy front, we need to make this issue front and center and lobby politicians in the way women in the Nordic social democracies have done, to say this labor that we are performing is immensely beneficial to capitalism, it absolutely has value even under your own definition of value, and we demand to be compensated for it. On the front of what we can do outside of our elected officials, it's time for some serious organization. We talk about this all the time in the form of unionization of workers broadly, but women absolutely need to unionize and strike on this very issue. And it's the kind of issue that is a precursor to a broader emancipatory socialist movement because it can cross industries. One of the limits to organized leftist politics in US history and throughout the rest of the world is that industries could not get along with one another and in fact competed. So you had the Steelworkers Union who wanted nothing to do with the Garbage Collectors Union, right? Well, if women can organize around the issue of labor that isn't narrowly focused on whether they are a stewardess or a barista or a librarian or a nurse or a teacher or a waitress, they can exert massive political influence around an issue in which they basically all have a shared interest. I'm sure I'm not the first to think of this idea. I tried to look around the literature for the idea of a home workers union, but all I could find was information about people who are employed as home workers for others, like maids and house cleaners. I will continue to search, and if any listeners find information, please let me know. But I very much think that we need to start developing the idea of a union for women to be organized and compensated for the currently unpaid labor they do at home, including childcare. The details of this would be more complex than a traditional union, but not remarkably so. The primary purpose would likely be to lobby government, but with a large enough membership, the possibilities are endless. Employers across all industries who employ any sizable number of women could be pressured to provide compensation for home labor as a condition of employment. That would raise wages dramatically and help close the pay gap. I've talked about this before, but I want to bring it up again because it very much applies to what I'm discussing here. There's this big question among leftists of reform versus revolution. I'm sure we all broadly know what that means, so I'm going to cut to the chase. My perspective is similar to what Karl Marx wrote when he was analyzing the programs of the French Workers' Party in response to those who claim reforms like universal healthcare and free education were just treats that capitalists threw out to de-radicalize people. Marx said if their perspective represented Marxism, then, quote, I, myself, am not a Marxist. Here's my interpretation of those words. Reforms that serve to reinforce capitalism and save it from itself should be opposed. Those that do the opposite should be encouraged and in fact fought for. So, for example, I obviously oppose Andrew Yang's version of UBI because it's paid for with a regressive value-added tax and it's meant to cut back welfare benefits. But even if Yang's UBI was progressively funded and put on top of welfare programs and put in place rent controls so landlords wouldn't just raise prices, I would still oppose it because its goal is to allow corporations to automate and for capital markets to keep functioning. It's a very pro-capitalist reform which is supposed to allow layoffs and give employers an excuse to keep wages low. The same is true of food stamps, by the way. It's a very bad program that allows for the continued commodification of food while the poorest can just barely afford to keep from starving. It's literally meant to both allow Walmart to pay its employees minimum wage and to keep the unemployed just barely alive. The opposite is true of universal healthcare. It's an anti-capitalist reform. It decommodifies healthcare and gives people say over their health needs, especially if it's done in a left-wing way. And yes, there's a left and right-wing version of universal healthcare. Let me spell this out very clearly, because it can be a bit confusing for the uninitiated. What are the effects of universal healthcare? What purpose does it serve as public policy? How is it anti-capitalist? The primary effect is the most obvious. The insurance companies and drug makers get eliminated as an industry. This is huge. Not only do they have enormous powers of life and death over all of us, they spend millions of dollars to influence politics. Clearing them out of the way represents a necessary, but obviously not sufficient step towards building a just world. The next major impact of single-payer healthcare is to roll back the power of employers. A surprising amount of employers are actually neutral or pro-single-payer, believe it or not, because they don't want to have to provide healthcare coverage to their employees. But think about the lack of mobility that we as employees have because we have a system in which healthcare is tied to where you work. How much money would you have to have in your savings account to leave a job with great healthcare coverage to try to pursue another venture where you were unsure about coverage? Basically beyond what any of us would ever dream of, right? Like imagine you have $8,000 in the bank. If you break your leg with no or bad coverage, that money's gone the second you step out of surgery. We know the massive amount of power employers wield, and a big portion of that is healthcare. So taking that away is anti-capitalist. And then finally, in a similar fashion but from a different angle, universal coverage would help labor unions maintain, expand, and form. We've seen this happen around the world. What often causes labor unions to back down is exactly this issue of healthcare, as you can see if you just Google union negotiation and read the stories around the country. Employers have, for a long time, said, sure, you can have a small pay increase, but we're going to take away your health benefits, which has made unions consistently back down for obvious reasons. You'd rather an employee have a small deductible on massive medical expenses than get a 75-cent raise per hour. Allowing unions to make militant demands without having healthcare hanging over their head as a constant concern is very much anti-capitalist. So you can probably guess my conclusion here. Treating childcare and home care as labor that deserves to be compensated is an anti-capitalist reform that I not only wholly support, but believe we should pursue aggressively. Why? Because it's not just an anti-capitalist reform. It's an anti-capitalist reform of the primary social relation for 50% of the population performing the most important job that we have as a species, a job that defines an unfathomable portion of our interaction with the world. Imagine women being fairly compensated for home labor, which would give them an enormous amount of power and even allow them to be, quote, unemployed in the job market without losing their livelihood. And being able to use that compensation included with another reform that we should push for, which is 12 months off for childcare like they have in Sweden to raise a child the way they saw fit, relieved from the pressure of having to work 43 hours per week, the average for a woman, and then squeezing in time for the child's development. There is not one thing you can think of in our entire society that would be unaffected, including this. I'm a big fan of neuroscience and psychology. It's what I read about away from politics and history. The science is clear in telling us that the first 2 years of a child's life are more pivotal than anything that comes thereafter. Some neuroscientists are so confident in this assertion, they're willing to say the first 2 years are basically all that matters. Our brain starts out as a smooth blob, and as we experience things, we form grooves. These grooves are formed by the age of 2. There's still development through the age of 25, but 24 months basically sets the fundamentals of who you are as a person. If you're like me, you are terrified of this reality. It's really fucking scary. But why? It's pretty obvious. We live in a capitalist hell where moms and dads have no guaranteed time off. It's a very normal reality for a father to go to work the day after they bring the baby home, and the mom isn't going back that long after. We can, and we must, build a society where parents have the freedom to focus on giving that child everything it needs in that time period, not having the baby look up at an ever-changing array of babysitters. To put what I just said in a Hallmark card, we need to fully compensate and democratize social reproduction. What does it mean to democratize social reproduction? It's more than just buzzwords. One thing I get really frustrated about when thinking about the American left is our lack of imagination. Corbyn and Labour is much better about this in the UK. One good example is their proposal for workers to have first rights to buy the company they work for if that company is trying to sell. So, before it moves hands to another exploitative capitalist, the workers can make a bid at market rate. They can also apply for lending from the British government to buy the company in the mold of a national public banking program. This is a very innovative proposal. It decreases the power of the capitalists, expands worker ownership in the means of production, limits rent sinking and improves corporate accountability, and expands the opportunity for the nationalization of the banking industry. It's creative because it's 1, very hard for capital to argue against, 2, in and of itself a big net positive that would be massively beneficial to workers, and 3, opens up a whole plethora of mechanisms by which radicals can take the ball and run with it. It's a perfect example of an anti-capitalist reform. We need to start thinking in these experimentative terms. The example I use to illustrate this idea in the United States is John Dewey. For those that don't know, John Dewey was an incredible educational reformer who entirely rethought the purpose of American education and, along with a few others, really rebuilt it from the ground up. Now, unsurprisingly, leftists have all kinds of criticisms of Dewey, but that's irrelevant to the discussion we're having here. The point is, he thought of institutions in a very systemic way and asked the question of what outcomes we want to come from them, and then, with those outcomes in mind, how do we design the institutional structures to achieve those goals? So, think about Bernie Sanders' free college plan. Let's imagine we fast forward to January 2021 and Bernie Sanders is being sworn in. He makes free college his first agenda item and gets it passed through the Senate's 52-seat Democratic majority who just voted to kill the legislative filibuster. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema vote against the bill, but Vice President Marianne Williamson breaks the tie. President Sanders just had his first big accomplishment, and tuition at public colleges and universities is now free. How excited would you be? And really think about this. When I think about this personally, I'd put my excitement level at maybe a 6. I have family members and comrades and future children who don't have to pay for college. That's awesome. But what really changed? I think back to my college experience and realized that, while I learned an enormous amount, most of it was from personal relationships that I built with professors and the intellectual work I did at home. When I think about most of my fellow students, they had a much worse experience than I did. A lot of them hated college, even though they loved learning. When I think of a bunch of kids I went to high school with, they still wouldn't have gone to college if it was free because college didn't offer anything to their particular skill set as a physical laborer. If I think about my graduating class, I still see a bunch of kids who graduated absolutely and objectively unequipped for a job in their field. And mostly that's irrelevant anyways because their field isn't hiring. Do you see what I'm saying here? Cost is but one factor explaining why college sucks, and overall a pretty small one. Most students who want to go and think they have a clear career path go anyways and deal with the debt burden down the road. The debt isn't the reason school sucks for a sizable chunk of them. It's the lack of direction and imagination and resources. It's the neoliberalization of higher education that has seen money flow away from academics into profit centers like fancy new common areas and football stadiums, and even more so to administrators. Ben Burgess, whose book and YouTube videos you should check out, talks about his experience at Rutgers in a way that exemplifies this perfectly. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but basically he's leaving Rutgers because the school rejected a package to actually pay a whole bunch of lecturers like him who have all the professional qualifications to teach full-time. The package to pay this group came out to something like $2.3 million. The school rejected this funding package in the very same summer they decided to spend $3 million on raising the pay of administrators as bonuses for performance. This is true of my previous university as well. A whole slew of professors are up and leaving because the school continues to hike tuition fees 3 to 5% every year, literally so they can pay administrators and deans who already make excellent money. It's bizarre. But my point here is the biggest limitation we have as a left in terms of what we're going to do when we take power, and as I've said, the Labour Party in the UK is infinitely better on this, is that the extent of our imagination is often limited to just funding things. Yes, college should be free, and we should pay the $70 billion it costs to make it so. That's obvious. But that has to be where the conversation begins, not where it ends. We need a generation of John Deweys across all industries to reinvent society at the institutional level. All single-payer systems are not created equal, for example. Canada's healthcare is pretty shitty compared to basically all the other single-payer systems in the world, whereas the UK's is pretty much universally considered the strongest. Some of this has to do with how it's funded and constructed, but it also has to do with the level of democratization. UK citizens actually have somewhat of a say in their health options. It's not a scenario in which you just replace private bureaucracy with government bureaucracy. So if our only goal on healthcare is to pass single payer, we're missing the boat. Not only do we not want a Canadian-style system, we want, and can have, a system that is way better than the UK. We haven't seen anything even close to optimal in healthcare yet. And I want to ask the listener, have you really ever thought about this before? I hadn't until very recently, when a few books and lectures started reframing my mindset. We rarely think in these terms. Imagine a system that isn't only free at the point of coverage, but one in which we actually have a seat at the table in terms of what we want our coverage to look like. All that leads to the area in which experimentation and democracy is perhaps the most important, and that's the idea of social reproduction. So let's go through the questions we want to ask. 1. How do we structure families and incentivize healthy relationships? 2. How do we treat sex and birth control and family planning? 3. How do we design the healthcare process when a woman is pregnant? Think about the way that our system helps and hurts children during the 9 months of which they are dependent on their mother. What do we want that healthcare experience to look like? And then think outside of the box. What if we had a welfare program that subsidized health foods for pregnant mothers? So during that time that you're pregnant, you get a government card that discounts fruits and vegetables and fish and dairy and nuts and whatever else research tells us women should eat to maximize the baby's health. Such a system sounds weird because we're used to such a limited framework, but it's extremely sensible. 4. What do we want childcare to look like? How much time do mom and dads get off? What kind of services should be open to them during that time? What does the day of an ideal baby look like in the first 2 years? And how can we give parents as many options available as possible? 5. How do we level the playing field for children and make sure the kids of poor parents aren't punished? Cory Booker's baby bonds is one such idea on this front that could be part of a package for building future financial stability for each child. Matt Brunig has a proposal called the Family Fund Pack that you can look up if you're interested, which takes a more holistic approach to having a child's basic needs met in addition to investing in their future. And then finally, 6, how early do we put children in an institutional learning space, and what should early childhood education look like? The data is clear that children who do pre-K perform better than those who don't. But to me, we haven't even cracked the surface. What does that pre-K education look like? How can we not just fund it more adequately, but rebuild it from the ground up with an intense focus and clear vision on what it is we want to accomplish? If we looked at problems in this way, the world would look vastly different than it does today, no? And by the way, a lot of socialist feminism is simply saying don't forget about us. And this is why it differs so much from liberal feminism. Because liberal feminism individualizes. It makes women's issues separate from the rest of society. They're not, of course. A huge part of socialist feminism is simply what we think of as regular socialism, albeit with women's interest in mind. So we talked about healthcare. There are a million different ways in which healthcare could be reformed and rethought to serve women better. And this is also true of people of color. For example, Black patients, both men and women, are consistently seen as having higher pain thresholds than white patients by doctors. This is replicated again and again. So, if a white person comes in limping, the doctor will grade them out as an 8 and give them the proper treatment, whereas a Black person with the same limp is graded out as a 6 and given different treatment. Think about the way we treat women in the education system. What's the primary push in education right now? Get more women into STEM, right? Well, of course, there's nothing wrong with women in STEM, and we should absolutely lower the barriers in place for them to pursue STEM, but maybe there's a reason some women don't want to be in STEM. The world is more than just STEM majors, and in fact, the evidence is showing that automation is coming for a lot of those jobs. People are going to be stunned when engineering and math jobs go the way of machines, while humanities-type jobs that require human intuition don't. Further, the plurality of our economy is now in the service sector, and that trend continues to grow rapidly. The problem isn't not having enough STEM majors, it's the fact that we pay STEM majors more than other jobs because we see them as socially valuable. This is a labor market compensation problem, not a problem of skill sets or scarcity. So when we design education and subsequently the labor market, we need to recognize that the gender pay gap is a policy choice and not something intrinsic about the work men and women do. On the point of the labor market, the big theme in the second part of this podcast is compensating home care and child care, which obviously is rethinking the economy in a way that includes women. And then let's look at the immigration system, for example. Our entire immigration enforcement apparatus is built exclusively on the idea of prime-age males crossing the border and both committing crimes as well as ruthlessly competing in the job market. People on both sides of the aisle believe this to be the case. The majority of migrants, though, are women, and it's true of an even higher percentage of refugees. Further, the sex trafficking of women through the border is literally considered only as a second or third order issue. Hopefully it's becoming obvious to you how much of our world is viewed through a man's lens and how we can push liberation for both genders while doing the hard work of taking into account women's issues where they haven't been taken into account before. This is what it means to be both a socialist and a feminist, and in fact to be both at the same time. So let's summarize what it means to be a feminist for the 99%. 1. Don't rely on the carceral system, which itself reproduces violence and repression of women to solve women's issues. It creates massive inequities and almost always ends up hurting the woman even more. 2. Market solutions are antithetical to emancipation. We don't need female presidents who don't fight for the working class, and we don't need girl bosses of oil companies. 3. It seems quaint in such a large project, but free and accessible birth control in every community in the country would have a massive impact on unwanted pregnancies, and women having genuine control over their bodies, not in the we have Roe v. Wade sense, but in the I get pregnant when and how I want to sense, is a shift in power towards women that is not to be sneered at. 4. We have to demand that the very serious labor that is childbearing and homework is fairly and adequately compensated. In the future, we will build a society in which men play the role they should. But until we can change socio-cultural realities, we have to enact good policy. 5. Women need to organize into a domestic workers' union that builds massive political power from the ground up and incorporates all kinds of different industries such that they cannot be ignored. If done correctly, this would be the most powerful organized body the federal government and capitalist class has ever been faced with. 6. Feminism, for the 99%, means not just 99% of women, but 99% of people. We can't make the mistake of forgetting our intersectional theory. Are women's issues Black issues and Latino issues? Well, women make up 50% of Blacks and Latinos. Are women's issues immigrant issues? Women make up 80% of global refugees. Are women's issues LGBT issues? That's so obvious I don't even need to spell it out. Just like we know that carceral feminism means the disproportionate locking up of Black and brown men, socialist feminism must recognize the way in which the solutions it advocates for affects other groups of working class people. 7. The feminization of labor is our new reality. Anybody who claims to be a leftist but isn't advocating that 47% of the American labor force and more than half of labor worldwide doesn't need to have active roles in leadership is delusional. The feminization of labor is a discussion of the capitalist market. But of course, it's not true that women just began laboring. When advocating our cause, we have to think outside of the box of the capitalist realist framework in which we exist and challenge hegemonic narratives of gendered capitalism. That is feminism for the 99%. I want to finish with the closing words of the Feminist Manifesto because few words have ever encapsulated my worldview so clearly. Quote, "The potential effects are very far-reaching. Feminist strikes are forcing us to rethink what constitutes class and what counts as class struggle. Karl Marx famously theorized the working class as the universal class. What he meant was that by fighting to overcome its own exploitation and domination, the working class was also challenging a social system that oppresses the overwhelming majority of the world's population and thereby forwarding the cause of humanity as such. But Marx's followers have not always grasped that neither the working class nor humanity is an undifferentiated, homogeneous entity, and that universality cannot be achieved by ignoring their internal differences. We are still paying the price today for these political and intellectual lapses. While neoliberals cynically celebrate diversity in order to prettify capital's predations, too many sections of the left still fall back on that old formula, holding that what unites us is an abstract and homogeneous notion of class, and that feminism and anti-racism can only divide us. Our manifesto rejects both perspectives. The class reductionist left one that conceives the working class as an empty, homogeneous abstraction, and the progressive neoliberal one that celebrates diversity for its own sake. In their place, we have proposed a universalism that acquires its form and content from the multiplicity of struggles from below. To be sure, the differences, inequalities, and hierarchies that inhere in capitalist social relations do give rise to conflicts of interest among the oppressed and exploited. And by itself, the proliferation of fragmentary struggles will not give birth to the sort of robust, broad-based alliances needed to transform society. However, such alliances will become utterly impossible if we fail to take our differences seriously. Far from proposing to obliterate or trivialize them, our manifesto advocates that we fight against capitalism's weaponization of our differences. Feminism for the 99% embodies this vision of universalism, always information, always open to transformation and contestation, and always establishing itself anew through solidarity. Feminism for the 99% is a restless, anti-capitalist feminism, one that can never be satisfied with equivalencies until we have equality, never satisfied with legal rights until we have justice, and never satisfied with democracy until individual freedom is calibrated on the basis of freedom for all.
I am speaking today, not just for the Me Too's, because I was a Me Too, but when I raise my hand, I am aware of all the women who are still in silence. The women who are faceless. The women who don't have the money and don't have the Constitution and who don't have the confidence and who don't have the images in our media that gives them a sense of self-worth enough to break their silence that's rooted in the shame of assault. That's rooted in the stigma of assault. Written on the Statue of Liberty is come. Come, you tireless, poor, yearning to breathe free. To breathe free. Every single day, your job as an American citizen is not just to fight for your rights. It's to fight for the right of every individual that is taking a breath, whose heart is pumping and breathing on this earth. And like the originators of the Me Too's, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Reese Taylors, who in 1944 was gang raped by 6 white men, and she spoke up. Rosa Parks fought for her rights. She was silenced. To the Tarana Burkes, to the originators, to first women to speak out, it cost them something. Nothing and no one can be great without a cost. Listen, I am always introduced as an award-winning actor, but my testimony is one of poverty. My testimony is one of being sexually assaulted and very much seeing a childhood that was robbed from me. And I know that every single day when I think of that, I know that the trauma of those events are still with me today. And that's what drives me into the voting booth. That's what allows me to listen to the women who are still in silence. That's what allows me even to become a citizen on this planet, is the fact that we are here to connect. That we are here as 324 million people living on this earth to know that every day that we breathe and we live, that we've got to bring up everyone with us. I stand in solidarity with all women who raised their hands because I know that it was not easy. And my hope for the future, my hope, and I do hope, that we never go back. That it's not just about clapping your hands and screaming and shouting every time someone says something that sounds good. It's about keeping it rolling once you go home.